Yeah, so let's begin. So the topic we're discussing is happiness, and this time I think I have a different approach in mind. I think so because happiness is a vague term in so many ways. We could talk about it beginning with we could begin talking about it by speaking of the difference between happiness and say things like pleasure, well-being, life satisfaction, stuff like that.
Sure.
Do you think that could be a good idea?
I'm ready to go for it. Yeah. Whenever you like to begin.
Perfect. So let's jump right in. What do you think is the difference between happiness and pleasure?
So I would say pleasure is a temporary sort of happiness, right? And it's usually a happiness that's bound to dissipate, given that it's tied usually to something like a sensory object or a substance or whatever else, right? And happiness is probably something a little more intrinsic, and I think, like we said before, it's sort of like this enabler for other things, instead of pleasure, which becomes like a goal, right? Happiness becomes a means, in my opinion. So that might be another cool difference.
Right. So what you're saying is pleasure is something temporary, and happiness is the longer, larger scale, long-lasting version of it.
Right,
Would
as
you
we know it.
say? Would I be right in saying that happiness has so pleasure can give you temporary happiness, or are they two completely different things?
I think it's probably an illusion of happiness. It's probably not the same as the real thing for most people. I think it's a substitute that they perceive as equivalent, which is what encourages behaviors like, repeated seeking of that pleasure, and then, a more negative sense, addiction type stuff.
Right.
And it's they're seeking that substitute, mistaking it for the real deal.
Uh huh. Makes sense. So yeah, we've established that happiness is something more permanent, and pleasure is can give you an illusion of happiness, but not the real happiness.
Right.
Sounds great. Let's talk about well-being. So usually when you ask people if you're happy or not,
Hmm.
their response usually comes as an answer to the question whether or not you are well. Basically, it becomes a question about well-being and how to
Right.
frame that.
Right.
Uh, yeah. So is there a difference between those two?
Well, um I think well-being probably has a little more structure to it than an idea of happiness.
Okay.
Because in my head, at least, maybe well-being can be bucketed into mental well-being, physical well. You can't be mentally happy, physically happy. Like, it's not the same thing. But well-being, meaning, are all systems up, right? Or is anything down, causing impediments to other things that you're trying to do in life? And I would say happiness is a boost, whereas well-being is like a kind of minimum benchmark, I guess, of function. As long as
So
everything's functioning, I don't think someone can say they're not well. So at least physically, maybe mentally too.
right. So if I'm getting you right, you're talking about uh, well-being as are you saying that well-being is when you're not in pain or not unwell rather, so there is no problem in your life and so
Right.
you're doing well.
Right. That it's a sort of neutrality between having a problem and being happy, like
uh
that kind of middle zone between the two.
right, makes sense. Yeah, that sounds like a good definition of
What
well-being.
what do you think about the difference between well-being and happiness?
So yeah, so what I think about well-being and happiness is I think I'm very much convinced by this. I didn't have a clear idea before now, but this makes a whole lot of sense because when you talk about well-being, you usually consider yourself. So if you ask me that if I'm happy right now, I'd say yes because there's no problem in my life. But
Mhm.
so the difference there would be between this and happiness that
Right.
there's nothing extraordinary going on, but yet there's nothing extraordinarily bad going
Right.
on either.
Right.
right?
And I think well-being, I just thought of a couple more buckets. You can have the physical and mental, you can have emotional as a more subset of mental well-being, you can have familial well-being, right?
Right.
Your relation to other creatures around you. So all of those are different from happiness, which is kind of yeah, like we said, an enabler.
Hmm. Cool. And so one last term that I would like to clarify. What do you think is the difference between life satisfaction and happiness? What I mean by that is, so usually people have goals in their lives, right? And
Hmm.
so this is something that I want. This is what I want to do, and if I achieve that, then if I'm satisfied with my life, then I'll be happy.
So let me turn it back at you. What do you define satisfaction as by itself?
Satisfaction, meaning. So I heard this amazing. There is a there is a speaker. I heard him talk about. I don't remember the name. I'll link it down.
Sure.
I heard him say that so the goals, that the desires that you have in life are a contract that you're signing with yourself, and you're saying that until I get this XYZ thing, I'll be unhappy.
Right.
So that is something that makes it a driving force,
Hmm.
and so then that desire, the achievement of that desire would be the satisfaction.
Well, in that case, would the achievement of that one desire be satisfaction as opposed to that desire creating a new one?
Right.
Um,
So if you have decided that this particular desire is the ultimate goal of my life,
hmm.
then that, so if I have a desire for a chocolate cake right now and
Right.
I eat that, then that would not be considered as life satisfaction. But let's say if my goal is to become a CEO of a company and
Hmm.
I finally achieve that,
Right.
I hope I do. Then that would be called as, I'd say that I'm pretty satisfied with my life.
Okay. Well, what if once you become CEO, your next thought is chairman, and then your next thought might be founder for your own company,
Yeah.
right? Well, it's a natural progression, I think, in most people. I don't know in your case specifically, but do you think that seems like, uh, kind of this, there's always something further, like in this path? Can you ever be completely done with the path of trying to seek leadership in an organization, as this example goes?
But yeah, so that's what, do you need to, I mean, do you need to have an end? What is so bad with wanting to go more and more forward?
Well, there's nothing bad. But I'm just trying to, in my head, initially, because when you asked life satisfaction versus happiness, my thoughts went back to bliss, right? And
Uh-huh.
because you said no more desires
Right.
once you've attained something. But I would now say that there's, based on the definition that you've sort of given me with the example, I would probably say that life satisfaction has to do with achievement, whereas
Mhm.
bliss has to do with the removal of desire, not the meeting of desire.
So
So
let's get into it. So
yeah,
then let's talk about bliss. Let's define bliss.
sure. So um I think bliss comes from being able to distinguish your idea of self with the idea of the physical components that people are attached to, things like their wealth, their culture, even their family, their friends, their country, even all of those things that we perceive as positive, right? Which leads to things like diversity, tolerance, all of that. If we stripped away everything, everyone would just be an isolated entity, just probably floating around in space with nothing left to want.
Mhm.
And when you want nothing, you don't really need to suffer anything. And I think that's a state of bliss.
Okay. So you say, if you strip all of that away, you wouldn't have any suffering. I,
Hmm.
I do agree to that point, and so this is the first time I get to ask this question. Is this practical though?
People have done it. So
But I
I
mean, as
for everyone, no.
exactly. So as a common philosophy for everyone,
Right.
I don't think this is practical, right?
Well, in the larger scheme of things, because people, well, I'm putting needs aside, because we do need money to provide for our bodies and our families. But aside from needs, I think people have the capability, but it depends on how, like, their upbringing is, the kind of people they interact with. And most of the things that we consider important are usually things that people around us considered important for so many years, right?
Right.
Whether we consciously want it to be or not. If someone's dad is like, getting that first job is the most important thing in college, then the focus is on that first job, and they might not go into research, for instance. They might, but like, they're probably more inclined because they know it's a tried and tested goal that
Mm-hmm.
that has provided for their own family in their own case, right?
Right.
So um that goal setting is probably what prevents most people, I think, from being able to do it. Maybe myself included, but it's definitely not an impossibility.
Right. So, but then you say that goal setting and having desires is the root cause of suffering and pain. That's something that keeps you away from happiness. Uh,
Right.
is that right?
It's not, that's not all it creates, but that's one of the effects. It also
Right.
creates, well-being, right? Because you once you have food, you're not hungry anymore, you're not starving. So
Uh-huh.
that's an instance of how it does help too.
Right. So yeah, but then that, again, so for a person like you and me,
Hmm.
who is very much in the real world and not willing to give up on the real worldly desires,
Hmm.
what is the alternative?
Well, I don't know if this is an alternative. I think all roads can still lead to it, because the search of bliss doesn't need to be an endless pursuit. Um, I think, because at least in the case of ancient Indians, there's four stages to life, right? You have Balyam, which is like, you're supposed to depend on everyone to raise you, feed you, and teach you things. Then you're a student, and you have to, go out in pursuit of knowledge in order to be able to create some sort of positive impact. And then you have the householder kind of, the family phase, where you have to provide for the people around you and your family, and continue your race. That's the part of life that, the third part of life, I guess. And then the last one is when you're done with all of that, what's left to do? You're just floating around with, like, you have people around to take care of you, hopefully, but your goals are kind of done. And some people set new ones. At that point, they might want to become founders or partners at a consulting firm or something. They rake in a million every bonus, right? So
Mhm.
that's one way to go about it. But um, I think at this phase, in ancient India, a lot of people, once they reached, like, post 60, they just went off into the mountains with, like, a simple loincloth and, bare minimum, like, they just built themselves a hut in the forest and meditated every day, which I think is the best of both worlds. They've, checked off their material goals, they've checked off their emotional goals and their family wise responsibilities, and then all that's left for them is to find that bliss, and at the time of death not be left needing anything, which ties them back to this world.
Right. So then, okay. So I do get the idea. So then it might be a good exercise for us to try and draw the differences between bliss and happiness.
Sure.
So one that I can think of off the top of my head is that bliss is kind of the end of all the um, I don't know how to frame it, but bliss basically is the lack of desire, right? And so there is nothing more that you want,
Right.
and so bliss would be the ultimate goal, uh, versus happiness, which would you call happiness as being
I think it's a bridge.
Okay.
It's a bridge to whatever you would like, and some of those goals, the ones associated with intrinsic good, I believe you mentioned before. I like that idea because it makes a clear difference between bliss as a goal versus a role, or something else as a goal, a car maybe as a goal. Once you have a car, you might want something else, but
Hmm.
uh, once you have bliss, it's the goal that leaves you with no other goals. So
Right.
in that sense, I think happiness is a bridge to that kind of endpoint.
So you're telling me that happiness is a way to achieve bliss.
Sure.
Okay.
And on that bridge, as you go towards bliss, you have the bridge gets thinner, and you have to keep throwing off the material luggage down the side in order to be able to reach through without breaking anything.
Right. That's an interesting analogy. So, but then if you say that bliss is the lack of all desires, that kind of sounds a little bit nihilistic to me. Would you consider a person who has no goals in life, who is just sitting, who just plays video games all day, for example? That person might say that I don't have any desires and hence I have no suffering, and I'm this is the best I could have asked for in my life.
Wait till they get hungry.
Yeah, but I mean, so they have a rich dad, let's say.
Okay. Wait till their dad says, "Yeah, I'm cutting your pocket change."
Yeah, but so exactly that's what I'm
So
trying to say. So
that's
then,
also temporary. I mean, this sounds kind of rude, but humans are temporary creatures. So at
uh-huh.
some point, the ability to provide for oneself and one's own family, in this world is inevitable. We're not doing, the barter system anymore. We do have to pay for our food, and there is an inevitability at some point down the road. Shooting directly for bliss might not be sustainable for everybody. That's that much. I'm ready to concede.
Right. And so then, exactly. So then, coming back to that trying to define trying to define happiness for the people who are not shooting directly for the bliss. So exactly as I said, people like you and me who are very much in the world.
Hmm.
Um, let's talk about the ways in which we could achieve happiness.
Sure. Um. So when you say way, do you mean a technique? Do you mean a thought process? How do you mean?
So basically, here's my idea. So if you're talking about happiness, there are two ways to look at it. You can either go after how you define happiness, what it is, and where it comes from, etc., etc., or you could talk about ways to achieve it.
Okay.
Uh, right. So we tried to talk about the definition of happiness, and we kind of got a good enough idea about it that it is a tool that empowers you to achieve the other things that you want.
Hmm.
And so now I would say that now I would try to ask about how to make sure that you have that tool.
Right. Um. I think this aspect ties back to, I think last time we were talking about hormones and how they kind of affect perceptions of pleasure, happiness, and
Right.
these things, right? So when the internal composition of hormones is in place, that's like a basic requirement.
Hmm.
Uh, but in addition to that, I think a sense of empowerment, which isn't really a hormone in and of itself, right? Because you hormones are simpler. You have reward, you have sleepiness, kind of. You have this content thing. But
Uh-huh.
empowerment is when you have the ability to motivate yourself into doing something, and that has to do with not being kind of either self-deprecating or bowing to other people's negative, unconstructive or maybe destructive feedback. And I think that sense of empowerment is a sure shot way of that happiness, being able to lead you to whatever goals. That's one possible avenue that can result in it, I think.
Right. And so we can't talk about happiness without at least talking about sadness.
Hmm.
So how do you define sadness, at least personally, if not globally?
Personally, there's been times, and I'm sure that it's been like this for a lot of people. There's been times where you can't really pinpoint why you're feeling a certain way. You wake up one day and you're just in that mood. It could be the weather, it could be uh, anything around, but I think sadness is probably just an instance of being unwell in the
Uh-huh.
mental sense, which is an inhibitor of achieving, everything that we want. Because sadness takes up more space in the brain than happiness, the way I see it, and that's one direct impact it has on the ability to motivate yourself to achieve. And some people, in the case of depression, it's because of that chemical imbalance in the brain. But that isn't to say, at least in most cases, that it can't be overcome. um, just because it's biological doesn't mean it's not compatible. um, we just need to find, I think, the levers that allow us to overcome. And again, I'm not the first person to say this. We've had a long history of people. I know Marcus Aurelius famously said that the happiness of your life depends on like the quality of your thoughts, which is a way to say that we have the video game controller in our hands.
Right. So you say the quality of your thoughts decide the level of happiness that you have. And yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Right. If your thoughts
Um,
are empowering, if your thoughts are, confidence boosting, probably not to a foolish level. Overconfidence is as bad as underconfidence, but probably worse. But yeah, I think the quality of our thoughts does kind of shape our ability to achieve whatever milestones.
right. And so that leads me to a question about. So I read somewhere. So while I was researching about this, I
Hmm.
came across a few people, a few ideas, a few theories saying, rather questioning if happiness is in fact valuable.
Well.
And so we say that everyone in is eventually essentially looking for happiness,
Hmm.
and we strive for it too much. Is that is happiness really as valuable as we think? Is it overrated?
Right. You took the word right out of my mouth at the end. I was going to say the same thing. Um, well, it depends on which side of the bridge you are. If you're on the bliss side, obviously happiness has no more meaning to you once you're at your destination. You might as well, burn the bridge and stay where you are, because bliss doesn't necessitate any other wants. But um, if you are someone who is still in search of something, even if it's something like a passion, right? And most people, by the time of college, were asked to pick a major without even knowing what we're passionate about in the rest of our lives.
Uh-huh.
But I think that's probably how happiness's importance changes depending on where you are. And there is a point where it is unnecessary, but I think in more places than not, it can be an absolutely helpful driving factor.
So yeah, as you say with your theory, that analogy sits in my head really amazingly well. That if you want to achieve something, uh, happiness is a tool that can help you achieve that in better ways and easier ways and
Yep.
faster ways. And so once you no longer desire anything, you do not need happiness
Hmm.
in your life.
Because
Makes
you've
sense.
you've also been able to cut the link between yourself and your emotions.
Uh-huh.
And as long as we treat happiness as the emotion that enables whatever else, once we've achieved whatever state of disconnection, that emotion is no longer relevant to us either way. So that's
Makes
probably,
sense.
yeah.
Right. Okay. Um, let's go back to talking about bliss a little bit. I am still a little bit skeptic about it.
Sure.
uh and so basically, let me tell you why it doesn't sit with me so well.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does have some sort of a, to me it sounds like it puts a negative uh, connotation to the human experience. And so what I mean by that is, when you say desire is something that you should get rid of, so if ideally it would be the best if you were to give up all desires, and you would feel the state of bliss. That to me sounds a little bit like a little negative. I mean, what I mean to say is that I'm not willing to accept the fact that the desire that is common to everyone, that is so fundamental to everyone in the human life, whoever is going through the human experience, uh, i'm not willing to I'm not willing to concede that it is something that requires to be given up.
Well, that's why, I mean, I think the people who couldn't let this sit well with themselves before came up with the right time in life. That's why I mentioned the four stages in the, the Sanskrit kind of, way of expressing life. I wish I knew the original words for all four of them, but they're pretty long words. But um, bliss
uh,
isn't for everyone at all times,
okay.
because I don't think that it's sustainable for the whole world to, because we are biological creatures and we are tied to this earth with biological needs. But as an idea, if like if you just were to sit there, just eyes closed, whatever, like whatever could happen, you're just sitting there, right? Your mom or your dad might come and look at you and wonder why, like you're doing that. Like, they've invested so much in your growth just to see you just sit there. Like, I'm not saying in your particular case, but um so if they were to, look at that and feel sad, you might want to give up that bliss, which means you haven't really reached bliss. You're probably on the way there. You If you care about that sadness in them, then you'd want to, rectify yourself to meet their kind of idea of what you should be. But if you don't care about that sadness, that's a link severed, and to you it carries no impact whatsoever. So is bliss a bad thing if you really care about nothing?
Okay.
Good and
um
bad is relative to what you care about, in my opinion.
so yeah, that is quite an interesting thought. And that makes sense to me on a way, on a level of a concept rather,
Mm-hmm.
that you could talk. So it's a good idea to have. um but I mean, I would say there is a whole lot more to look forward to in the human experience. The pain, the suffering, the pleasures, the happiness,
The journey.
yeah, exactly, all the sides of it, the entire journey seems like a more interesting, a more rewarding sort of a thing than giving everything up.
Well, then, since you care about interesting, you care about rewarding,
Uh-huh.
you care about, maybe, in a more short term, cruder word way, thrill, right? The thrill of living.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think, again, bliss doesn't have to be for everyone. It doesn't have to be at all times. But maybe, you're gonna grow a big old white beard one day and say, life has been thrilling enough, and I don't really see anything particularly, intrinsic to my well-being that I don't already have. So
Uh-huh.
why not just cut myself out from everything that I think makes me up, and seek this state of nothingness.
Amazing. That sounds like an amazing idea. I would still not consider it to be
I take
my
no credit. I didn't make it.
uh-huh. Amazing. That's a great conversation that we had.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
no worries.